All right. Well, this is a beta version here. Just a quick test lecture. Um, this is basically on very early Middle Ages. Um, Germanic vengeance and law. Now, just in case you are wondering what qualifies as Germanic, now clearly the German people count, right? Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind is that there is, at this moment, no nation state called Germany. Um, you don't get a really unified, excluding Austria, of course, but you don't get a unified Germany until, at least the way I'm going to teach it, till about 1871, certainly the 1870s. But when we talk about Germanics, we're talking about the tribes of mainly Northern European peoples. I suppose, depending upon how you look at it, you could look at those Franks as Germanics. Um, Also, I should bring up the fact that I remember having this interesting discussion with someone when I was trying to explain, that the Germans were also indeed Germanics themselves. The young lady, the lady was probably about my age. She said the Germans were not Germanics; they were Teutons. Well, no, that's the same thing. Teutons and Germanics are the same. So that's actually an alternative definition. But at any rate, um, alternative description. But the Germanics would be people such as people you've heard of before. Obviously, people who would basically be Germans eventually. I think you can put in the Franks. I would do that. Um, People who would have been known at the time as Orthogoths, Visigoths, um, the Vandals. I would say the Vandals are Germanics. Um, Scandinavians, so the Vikings would be considered Germanic. Anglo Saxons would be considered Germanics. People who you would qualify as Dutch, they would indeed be Germanic. Dutch is indeed a Germanic language. Norwegian is indeed a Germanic language. English is indeed a Germanic language. Doesn't seem that way, but if you look at some things like an and und, for example, um, anyway, we could go on and on. I don't have too much time to talk about this. But when we talk about Germanic law, vengeance and law, I will tell you clearly the kings, are obviously the highest, if you will, position of authority. But I will say um, that typically it's really the assemblies, more local assemblies, if you will, that are carrying out justice, however you want to think of justice. However it could be interesting, when you talk about justice during this period of time. Now, here's another thing. Um, I know that I teach a number of criminal justice students, and they may be appalled by, some of the methods that they may use in this case when it comes to meting out justice. They had indeed very arcane, archaic um, ideas on guilt, arcane ways of determining whether or not someone is guilty or innocent. Um, Clearly obsolete ways of carrying out justice. Now, one of them that comes to mind is this idea of congregation. Now, it's interesting. I've taught about this for quite a number of years. Um, and I remember it came up in a church meeting. Not in a church meeting, but in a Bible study I was actually in. And there was a lawyer there. And he was bringing up, this fact of like 12 men being chosen, and this being background of a jury, that they were really there to testify to the character. Now, what this person didn't do was give or to name, if you will, this process. This was known as congregation. Congregation. So basically, you take about 12 witnesses, probably men, and they're going to testify to the character of the accused. So, so they're looking at, basically with this person, have you known this person to ever do such a heinous act? Would this be a person that could ever bring themselves to do something so low? So witnesses are indeed testifying indeed to the character of the person being accused. Now, what are you expecting? See, you are expecting a jury, right? And a jury that is going to rely on evidence, whether it be circumstantial evidence, whether it be forensics, right? Do we have some blood, some hair at the scene? Is there, scraping of scrap of clothing there? Is there skin underneath the fingernails? Correct? What have you? You're expecting a crime scene investigation, correct? That's what you are expecting. Well, understand, at this time, those forms of technology are not available to these folks. They're working with what they've got. So when we look at evidence, we have to look at things a little differently, if you will, in this regard. Now, also, when we're looking at these things, we'll find out that they have some interesting ways of determining guilt. So that brings us to an ordeal. Now, what do you think of when you think of an ordeal? You're probably thinking of somebody who has, is having a tough time at things, right? Boy, they had a rough day. They went through a lot. A lot of things have happened to them. And a lot of these things they feel probably were things that weren't necessary for, that they didn't have to happen, but whatever reason they happened. Well, they occurred. Well, an ordeal in its original sense, well, my goodness, it's a lot rougher than that. It is indeed a trial to determine the guilt or innocence of a person by using mainly, if you will, supernatural tests. They all weren't supernatural, but most of them were, if you will, supernatural tests. So let's think of some examples. Trial by water. Now, some of these versions would be trial by hot water. Can you stand scolding hot water? And what will happen to marks on your body. Now, there was also trial by cold water. There were several versions of that. Now, also, probably the most famous version of this trial, this ordeal, would probably be the one where what? You take a witch, a person who's being accused of witchcraft, throw them in the water, right? And if the person floats, this person is not. If the person floats, they're indeed a witch, and basically are subject to execution. If they drown, they're not a witch, and they can be absolved of the whole thing. They're dead, but at least you can save their soul. At least you can basically say, well, you know what, their soul was indeed pure. That they didn't commit, the crime of witchcraft. Yeah, it's too bad they're dead, but we'll look over, we'll absolve that, the fact that they died, our bad. There was trial by fire. One of these versions would call for you to perhaps walk 9 feet of a hot surface, just a flaming hot surface, and if you were scarred up, you may well find yourself in a position of being guilty. It can get complicated, but I got a lot of other stuff to cover here. There was also trial by hot iron too. You touch a hot iron, a hot piece of iron, and if your hand, swells up, you could be guilty. And let me assure you, it's likely to swell up. There was another one. This one may have been among the easier ones. It was trial by cake. If you ate this piece of cake, supposedly, and didn't choke, you were, innocent. Generally people passed that, although supposedly there was one person who may well have choked and died on this one. Some of these get very silly. I skipped trial by turf. Trial by turf was an Icelandic ordeal. That was the idea that you would walk under, hanging turf. And if the turf falls on you, you were guilty. Trial by combat. The idea that the person who loses, if you will, this fight, which could be, where basically you each may have maces in your hand, wooden maces, and if you lose that, you were guilty, that type of stuff. Alrighty. Well, they try to straighten a lot of this stuff out. Now, I will tell you that a lot of this stuff in regards to the ordeals, they last beyond the early Middle Ages, into the medieval period, the high Middle Ages, into, if you will, the late Middle Ages. And my goodness, one of these, trial by combat, apparently had happened in the 1800s. So they lasted for a little while. But when we looked at these Western Germanics, for example, England would be a good example of that. A lot of these folks tried to, make more civilized laws. And on top of that, codify laws. So, making law codes that people can read, preview, know what's before them. I would venture to say Hammurabi's code might be obviously not part of this, but this would, when we talk about law codes, Hammurabi's codes, way back when, the earlier portion of the Mesopotamian era, Mesopotamian civilization would be an example of codification of law. Justinian code, for example. Anyway, so they're codifying this law. They're putting this law, jotting it down, and making sure that people know that there's going to be some access to it. You see a number of village tribunals where you have these local assemblies, local, if you will, courts to determine whether or not somebody was guilty, whether or not somebody owed someone compensation. Now, we also have another issue. Okay. So I'm not sure if you've ever seen this before, but there was a guy, he had killed a gentleman's daughter. And guess what that guy did? Pause the video if you like. Guess what do you think this guy did? The guy who, whose daughter died. Well, he lunged out at this guy. He jumped at him. He tried to obviously go after this fella. There was another guy who calmly asked, if you will, the judge if he could have 5 minutes with this fella, basically because the guy had molested his daughter, and he tried to go after this fella. Well, indeed, vengeance is an issue. A lot of people would go eye for eye. You kill one of mine, I will kill one of yours. And there was attempts, if you will, to regulate this vengeance, this private vengeance. If you kill one in my family, I'll kill one in your family. Now, one way that they tried to do this, if you will, was through something called word geld. Okay, well, word geld. All right. Just in case you're wondering what that's about. Well, could you tell me what this is? What is it? Well, clearly, that is a representation, if you will, of a werewolf, right? What is a werewolf? A werewolf is someone who is an anthropomorphic being, right? Temporarily anthropomorphic being. So in other words, that is to say that he's part man, part animal. So in this case, part man, part wolf. Werewolf, man, wolf. Well, understand that were and where are what? These are Old English versions of the word man. If you were ever to look at Old English, you will notice that it looks a great deal different from the modern English you have here, right? You have Old English. You have, if you will, Middle English. Middle English, you could probably, you'd notice thee, thine, thou, that type of stuff. Showeth. You would see a lot of Middle English in what? King James Bible. So were means man. Man, gold. Geld is just another way of saying gold. Gild, to cover thinly with gold, right? So were geld means, if you will, man gold. What the Sam Hill does that mean? Well, that means we are willing to compensate you financially, for tragic events such as murder. So in other words, money settlement for murder, for example. That's not all it is. But, so you kill one of mine, hold on a second. We need to go through a process, and you can compensate me financially for the person that we lost in our clan, if you will, with a C, have mercy, with a C. Compensation had depended on the social standing of the victim. So if the victim was, rich, or noble class, or, of a higher station in life, you would likely have to, if you will, pay more than somebody who simply put was a peasant, just a simple farmer. It depended on the social standing of the victim. So clearly it wasn't all fair. Now we also know that there are going to be later cases, later offenses that we will include. Rape will go under word geld, adultery, assault, so on and so forth. These things will go under, if you will, the idea of word geld. So understand that the vengeance that you see these days, and how people try to approach, confront it, how to punish, if you will, this idea of vengeance in crimes. It was a long time in the making. So understand that evolves over time. All righty. Take care, everybody. And it was fun, if you will, doing this beta lecture. Let's see how it works out. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.